welcome to another episode of Alan Stead Reviews. Today we're going to be ranking the 15 studio albums of Pink Floyd from worst to best. Yes, Roger Waters has been in the media a bit recently and all sorts of stuff is going on there, but we don't care about all that. We're here to talk about the music, and let's go. Okay, so for a quick crash course history lesson in Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd rose to prominence very quickly in the mid-60s, led by Syd Barrett, and became a leading psychedelic act. Unfortunately, after the first album, he took too much LSD and never fully recovered from that. And for the next few albums, on which he features partially on the first of those, they were really trying to rediscover themselves as a band, with Dave Gilmour having stepped in and taken his place. By the time you get to the 70s, you hit what would be many would consider to be their peak era, which continues through albums like Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here. And then towards the end of that era, Roger Waters begins to take over as the leading force, with Animals, more so even on The Wall, during which he sacked Richard Wright, the keyboard player, and then finally with the final cut, to such an extent it's almost considered a Roger Waters solo album. Roger Waters then left in 1985, saying that Pink Floyd was no more. Dave Gilmour had different ideas and decided to restart the band, and there was a different incarnation of the band that continued for another couple of albums, and then finally years later there was kind of another album which I'll get to in due course, but that's a very rough sort of guide to what's going on there. Tracks not featured on the 15 albums I'll be running through. Now I'm popping a thing up at the corner there. That is the name of an album that is the first CD in a massive box set. You can stream it as well, but definitely check that one out. That's got the first 3 singles, a whole heap of other stuff, absolutely essential. And there's Relics as well, which has, I'll list the tracks on there. If you've listened to that album I've just mentioned and that, you've got a pretty good spread of non-album tracks there. There's also an early version of Interstellar Overdrive that is a real must, a 16-17 minute version. There's another song on there called Nick's Boogie as well, but if you can look that up online, very different version, very worth checking out. As for live albums, yeah, I've got the Ummmagumma live album here. I'm not including that as part of my Ummmagumma review because I'm just doing the studio half. The first track is maybe worth checking out on there, but the other songs on there are done to much better effect at Pink Floyd Live at Pompeii. If you get this DVD, be sure to check out the bonus features for the proper original version of the film as opposed to the redone director's cut. I've also got an incomplete sort of cover there for Pulse, which is a later live album. The outer bit is missing for some reason. Yeah. As for the 2 Syd Barrett solo albums he did after leaving the band, they're very rough around the edges, to say the least. The playing's very loose, but that they have somewhat of a cult following because he's got a very unique sort of delivery. I mean, he wasn't in a good place at the time, and the lyrics can often be disorientated, and it doesn't sound like he often knows what he's singing about. And yet there's a real poignance there, a whimsicalness as well, a sense of humour, but in the same sentence. I mean, tracks like Dark Globe, Feel, and Long Gone, they're probably my favourites off the first album. That's definitely the Madcap Laughs is the one that I think is the one that's the best. The second album is a little bit more produced up. It's still kind of very rough, obviously, but the songs just aren't quite so good. So the first album is definitely the better of the 2 albums, although I do love Effervescing Elephant off the second album. But Syd Barrett literally is this whole experience that is separate from Floyd that is just worth checking out unto its own right. I have another couple of albums. There's like an outtakes album, Opel, which is even more rough around the edges, and there was this album as well, which has got a couple of tracks on it that you can't get otherwise, which I'll pop up there. Yeah. As for the other Pink Floyd solo albums, I've been pretty unimpressed with everything that I've heard. I did buy the first Roger Waters solo album that was released in the 80s, Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. I found it to be pretty much unlistenable, as was the case with these next two albums. And the Dave Gilmour ones I don't like for different reasons. Definitely worth checking out Music from the Body, though, which is Ron Geesin and Roger Waters' collaboratory effort done just before the Atom Heart Mother, which Ron Geesin worked with Pink Pink Floyd on. It's just so out there. It's just worth checking out. I'd probably give it like a 7 out of 10. It's not perfect, but it's just More Than Seven Dwarves in Penis Land is a name of a track on there. I thought something like that. Go for it. Now, with my Pink Floyd CDs, most of them are the 1994 versions, but I have been listening to the 2011 remasters, and I must admit I'm pretty impressed with what I've heard so far, especially on A Saucerful of Secrets, where Set the Controls for the Sun had this weird little glitchy bit in the and the CD version I had. Don't think it was my CD. Anyway, that's been corrected, but there's lots of things. It just levels stuff. It just sounds better generally. The 2011 remasters are good. The only two CDs that I've got of those are A Momentary Lapse of Reason, which was the last Floyd album I bought anyway, and that was a later purchase, and also I got the final cut. I do have the original somewhere, but they added the track When the Tigers Broke Free, which I just thought would fit into the album nicely, as it wasn't on an album up to that point. So there we go. In at number 15, The Endless River. I don't have the CD for this one, and I don't feel like my CD collection is incomplete because of it. Basically, Richard Wright had recorded some soundscapes of keyboard stuff round about the time of the Division Bell, and years later, after his passing, as a tribute to him somewhat, Dave Gilmour and Nick Mason decide to build an album around those soundscapes, and largely it's just David just noodling away on the guitar with solos that just go on and on and on over these keyboard soundscapes, and unfortunately it's very, very boring. And when it does go into a song at the very end of the album, the only thing that's not instrumental, you kind of rather wish it hadn't. So sadly, I am being really harsh with that, and I'm giving it a 3 out of 10. Sorry. In at number 14, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Now, this started off as a Dave Gilmour solo album, which he then decided should be a Pink Floyd album. And this was after Roger had left. And in fact, the other two members don't really feature much on this at all either, because they'd largely had all their parts recorded by the time they got on board. So I don't think Nick plays any drums on this. He just does sound effects, and Richard Wright basically plays some Hammond organ and maybe a few other keyboard parts. But again, most of the keyboards on this are not him. So it does sound very different, and it's a Pink Floyd album kind of almost just in name, which is a shame. And, but it is what it is. And I do quite like it in spite of itself sometimes. They have done a more modern recording of it, replacing the old drum parts. But to be honest, I think if you're going to listen to it, I didn't like what I heard of that. Just listen to it, embrace it for what it was. That being said, it's only a 5.5. I think this is not the Pink Floyd I know and love. But in spite of such a low score, I'd probably visit this album more than it deserves. It's got something. In at number 13, we have The Division Bell. Now, largely, I would say this album is weaker than A Momentary Lapse of Reason, but I love the opening track, Cluster 1, which really sort of sets you up sort of for feeling you're going to get much more of an authentic Pink Floyd album, and the closing track, High Hopes, which is one of my favourite Pink Floyd songs, to be honest, and it's got big epic strings. Sort of, it really feels like it nods back to that classic sort of Pink Floyd sound. Like I say, I draw slight parallels. I'll come to this song later, but the Narrow Way Part 3, I sort of feel there's a connection between them lyrically as well. It's a great way to finish the album. The rest of this album, though, very mediocre. In fact, below mediocre, with several songs sounding like they're simply a launch pad for Dave Gilmour to noodle away on the guitar for ages with forgettable solos that just go on and on. And there's one song that even sounds like it could be them trying to do like a U2 song, which is not necessarily a great thing. I give this a 5.5. Because, to be honest, most of it is pretty bad, but there's two really great tracks, one of them particularly great, High Hopes, check it out. In at number 12, we have the soundtrack to the film More. The first half of this album has a number of dreamy acoustic songs with sort of drifty keyboard sequences by Richard Wright that really sort of make them vibey. You've also got a couple of instrumental cues and my favourite track on the album, which is the rocky and aggressive, surprisingly aggressive, in fact, Nile song, which is a really good listen. The second half of the album is largely instrumental cues from the album, with the exception of Ibiza Bar, which I don't like because it kind of repeats the Nile song to lesser effect. And apart from main theme, which kicks off the second side, it's not really much to write home about on that side of things. So I would say this album's sort of so vague in its ways that it's almost not there at all. And it's only for that reason I'm kind of giving it a 6. Like I say, some really good moments. Cirrus Minor is a great opening number there. But I said the second half of the album is, Number 11, Ummmagumma. This sees the band at their most avant-garde, and it's split into 4 sections, each done by each band member. You got the kind of orchestral style, well, there's no orchestra, but orchestra with the keyboards meets avant-garde nightmare of Richard Wright's Sisyphus. This leads into possibly one of the most tranquil songs I've ever heard, Grantchester Meadows this is a Roger Waters track with a bird in it that whenever I go for walks across the downs, I go, oh, it's the Pink Floyd bird. I forget the species. If you know, put it in the comments. This leads into several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pick. I'm not going to explain that track, just listen to it. My favourite track on the album is a Dave Gilmour track, his first proper song that he did with the band, The Narrow Way Part 3, which is a really great song and almost the only sort of fully normal song on this record, apart from Grantchester Meadows perhaps. And I particularly love the transition from part 2 into 3. It's a very beautiful song. Almost seems to sort of nod towards High Hopes that was on their final album. It's sort of, there's a similarity between the songs, although they're very different. My least favourite track would be the Grand Vizier's Garden Party, which is basically Nick Mason messing around with drum effects largely for many minutes, and you won't get that time back. So it's probably only for that reason actually that I'm sort of marking it down a little bit. 7.5 for that. Number 10, The Final Cut. Many people consider this to be more of a Roger Waters solo album than a Pink Floyd album, and I think they're right to an extent. Dave Gilmour certainly, although he is present on this album, his guitar solos seem very sort of stilted and kind of not very inspired, apart from on one track where he kind of lets loose a bit, which is Not Now John. I would say that the style of a lot of what's going on here is very similar to the more orchestral moments on The Wall, and there is a bit of musical repetition in terms of you've kind of heard those chord sequences before, and he does the same sort of vocal thing where he's going, I can't do it, but you know what I mean. He does the vocal sort of style that he then just continues to adopt for the rest of his career after this. And I think people kind of get to a certain point career-wise and get stuck in a rut. It's still reasonably fresh here, but you have to kind of get into the zone with this one. It's actually a very interesting story. The soundscape is great. Nick Mason doing a lot of the sound effects still. So it still has that sort of nice sort of soundscape. Bit 80s sounding, but not as much as what it would be on the next album. I give it a 7.5. I am stoically on the fence with this one, but I mostly like it. In at number 9, we have A Saucerful of Secrets. This is the band's second album and sees them in a bit of a transitional phase from the first album with Syd Barrett into where they would go next. He only actually does one song on this album, the closing Jug Band Blues, which seems a bit like a melancholy farewell on his part, complete with a confused Salvation Army band and chaotic guitar. It really is quite something to hear. My other favourite track is indicative of perhaps where they were going to go in the future, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, sort of much more sort of drifty, long form sort of piece there. And you've got A Saucerful of Secrets, which is the big epic song on this. I struggle with the first 2 bits of that, but the final bit really is worth it. And you've got 2 very nice Richard Wright songs. Remember a Day is particularly beautiful, some slide guitar on that from Syd. It really does capture that sort of nursery rhyme quality of Syd's writing, so they sort of hold on to that a bit. The opening track is perhaps indicative of what I feel about a lot of this album. It starts off with a really great opening minute and then kind of feels a little bit awkward, and the production's a little bit off for the rest of the track. My least favourite on here would probably be Corporal Clegg, because it's just a bit silly. It's like they're trying to do what Syd Barrett would do, but when he does it, it doesn't sound silly. It just sounds like Syd, whereas when they do that, it sounds silly. 8.5 for this. Number 8, Obscured by Clouds. Now, of all the Pink Floyd albums, I'd say this is the one that's grown on me the most. And you see a move towards, for the most part, a more conventional songwriting style on here, although you do have a fair amount of instrumentals here. The opening track, title track, for some reason reminds me a bit of Crocodile Dundee, the theme from that, which I quite like, the Crocodile Dundee theme, so that's not a negative. The second half of this album, though, is really without fault. That's where it really picks up. As for the first half, I'm not really a fan of the most of the tracks in it, apart from the closing one, What's the Deal, which is a great acoustic song. Second half, you've got 2 great instrumentals, and you've got a song each by each member of the band. My favourite probably being Childhood's End by Dave Gilmour, but each of them are actually worthy of being the best track on the album. I love the final track as well, where it transitions off into the tribal chanting at the end, because this was a soundtrack movie, and that's obviously a soundtrack to the. It's, you know what I mean? I'm going to write it up at the top. I can't, I'll get it right. It'd be fine. It's an 8.5. It's really great. Number 7, and we are getting to the big potatoes here. Atom Heart Mother. Let's split this album into its 2 halves. You got the title track is on the first half, and that's the orchestra meets the band. Ron Geesin, who I mentioned earlier, he collaborated with them on this, and you really do get the sense that they're getting this song achieved by the skin of their teeth. It worked. This album went to number 1, but there's bits that work better than other bits. But Dave Gilmour particularly, you can really hear him coming into his own with his soloing ability and that sort of move towards that sort of classic sound. Second half, you've got a track by each of the main songwriting members, very different, each of them. I think they get better as they go along. My favourite of them being Fat Old Son, which features perhaps the gentlest Dave Gilmour vocals of all time. And then you finish off with Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, which is... it's filler through and through, with sound effects of a man eating breakfast in various different ways with little musical interludes. But somehow Pink Floyd make that sound good. That's how good this band is. It's a 9.5. It's, great. Number 6, Meddle. I've gone with this one above Atom Heart Mother, although it's changed back and forth a few times when I was doing this, simply because it sort of feels like they've nailed that modern sound that they would continue going forward with into albums such as Dark Side of the Moon, and they do that with this one. You've got the opening track, which is a very aggressive sounding, like a rocky Doctor Who kind of vibe, and sort of that's a really kind of vibey intro. It kind of goes off into sort of lighter acoustic stuff for the remnants of side A, which I still like, though. I think it's still really great. Finishes with Seamus, which is a lot of people don't like, but he's a lovely boy. He's a good boy. Yeah. If you know the song, you'll get that. Side B, though, Echoes, and that is really the crowning jewel of this album. And it's, I don't need to go into the whole length of the describing about it. It starts and finishes as a song. You've got a kind of jammy section that kind of goes off into this wilderness of seagulls guitar. He's making his guitar sound like a seagull, which is really cool. My favourite sequence, though, is the way it builds back into the song. That really is a spine-tingling moment, and one of the greatest moments in rock history. So yes, this is a 9.5. Enjoy it. Number 5, Animals. This is sort of a bit of a dark concept to this, based on George Orwell's Animal Farm. It's very much a Roger Waters led affair, and this is the beginning of his sort of phase of taking over the band. But Dogs is a great collaboration between him and Dave Gilmour, and just one of my favourite Pink Floyd tracks. A bit like in the way that Echoes goes through many different sections, so does this, but this one's tighter. It's a bit more streamlined, it's less over the top, and it's way better for that. Brilliant guitar solos, brilliant subject matter, with the sort of quite dark subject matter there. The second half of the album, it continues in very high quality. Not quite as good as the first half, but that's a very small thing there. I think that this record was almost a bit of a sort of nod to the fact that punk was a big thing at this time in 77, and this is acknowledging that, I think, musically, and that's why that touch of aggression that's going on here really does it justice. Also, it's very slick. I think this and Wish You Were Here perhaps are the most slick Pink Floyd albums when you listen to them now. It's just slick. It's great. 9.5. It's just a fraction off perfection. In at number 4, we have The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now, this album is a masterpiece of 1960s psychedelic rock, and I would say the quintessential album of that style, if you want to go down that route. The Beatles kind of flirted with it, but this is full on. It's got everything from the opening space rock of Astronomy Domine to the chaotic, aggressive avant-garde 9-minute song of Interstellar Overdrive, to the closing whimsy of Bike, with its kind of nursery rhyme quality, concluding in a sound effects sequence here. Now, I think nursery rhyme is a good sort of a way of sort of thinking about a lot of these songs, but nursery rhymes with an edge. And certainly by the time you get to the middle section of the album, it really does get quite aggressive and sort of more rocky. I think it's definitely there's an influence here that is probably rubbed off on bands like the Mars Volta, who in fact did a cover of Candy in a Currant Bun. There's a very different style going on here to what's happening on the subsequent Pink Floyd albums, and yet it's all very accessible and easy to listen to, and you've got some super melodic moments on here. Chapter 24 would be almost like the spiritual climax of the album, with some beautiful keyboard parts there, feeling quite orchestral even though they're obviously keyboards. And Matilda Mother there is a very lovely song about being told childhood stories by his mother. So a 10 out of 10. This is just amazing. Number 3, The Wall. This exists on such a huge scale, this album. It's more like sort of watching a film, really. Well, it was made into a film a few years later, which is a kind of different experience, so I won't go into that so much, although that is definitely worth a watch. But most of the time when I go for The Wall, I listen to the album, and it's a Roger Waters-led affair, although Dave Gilmour makes some very significant contributions, perhaps most famously on Comfortably Numb, and also his guitar solo at the end of Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. There is recurring themes that happens through this, and recurring voices, great sound effects. You've got a plane crashing at the end of the or dive bombing at the end of the opening track. You've got a character in it who sounds like groundskeeper Willie from The Simpsons for some reason. How can you have any pudding if you haven't had your meat? It's great stuff. It's hard to explain out of context, but it's fantastic. Orchestras appear in the second half of this album, and it builds towards this bombastic conclusion in which the wall gets broken down, the wall of in his mind of neurosis, and is largely autobiographical in some respects. Roger Waters' dad died during the war. But it's about that in part. But it's one of those things, I think, with all the best works of art, and regardless of where Roger Waters was coming with this, I think the best works of art, you can interpret them in many ways. And I think we've all been in places where we've felt fragile emotionally, and we've had all sorts of stuff going through our heads, and we sometimes have to confront that. And that is all about what this album is about, and it does it in spectacular operatic style. Operatic style at the end. I'm going to shut up now. This is a 10. In at number 2, Wish You Were Here. I so nearly put this as my number 1 choice because it is the most beautiful Pink Floyd album. I think in terms of guitar solos and keyboards, definitely I think it's the finest Pink Floyd thing. Shine On You Crazy Diamond, split into 2 sections, which starts and finishes this album, is just a showcase of how brilliant this band is. Really vibey, obviously very sad as well, because this entire album was dedicated to Syd Barrett, who actually turned up unexpectedly during the sessions for this, looking unrecognisable. Wish You Were Here is another song that is directly written about Syd, and that's a more sort of understated, sort of lovely acoustic song. I think Shine On You Crazy Diamond, that's my favourite Pink Floyd song. Which part one or part two? Well, no, you can't really separate them out in your mind. For me, you've got another two songs on here which are both really cool as well. You could perceive there as being almost a bit of a dip in quality because the other tracks I've talked about are so good when you go to those songs, but in fact they're really cool as well. It is a really peaceful album. I'd described as almost the first come down Pink Floyd album, where they've taken stock of what's happened to them so far, and they've kind of had a little look back retrospectively, and they're yet to start falling out with each other, which is also a pleasant thing. 10 out of 10. 10. Dark Side of the Moon. Obviously, Dark Side of the Moon at number one. And this is an album where the production really steps up a big notch. Not only are the band at the top of their game, but this sounds like it's something that could have been recorded yesterday, quite frankly. And it sort of pays homage to that sort of avant-garde that they've been doing up until that point. But with On the Run is the track I'm referring to, but they make it electronic, and that sort of pushes things into the future. So it takes the avant-garde and makes it sort of a crazy sort of modern thing going on there. Beautiful soulfulness of A Great Gig in the Sky, the soaring guitar solo in Time, and the climactic conclusion of the whole album. You've got obviously all the voices that appear throughout it and the various sound effects. That was a genius sort of decision to have people talking about various subject matters, and that really sort of is part of one of the many things that really bonds this whole album together. It surrounds and binds it, yes. And I haven't got my thing ready, but I do now, and it is dun dun. Yeah, there it is. It's a 10 out of 10. I could say so much more, but this is just a ranking. So there you go. I hope you have enjoyed all this stuff.